We'll begin by praying that the zchut of our learning should help to bring home the hostages and protect our soldiers and Am Yisrael and all of the innocents and bring a speedy end to the war. And with that, let's go back to the Gemara. So we spent the last few shiurim on this Gemara that's trying to figure out where do we see an azhara for inui in the Torah? Just to review some of the basic points. So we had this as a question at the beginning of the sugya, where Reish Lakish asked this as a question. He said, "Mibnei ma lo nemra azhara b'inui." Why didn't the Torah give us an azhara? In other words, why wasn't there an explicit pasuk that formulated, that expressed the isur connected with inui on Yom Kippurim? So he said, because it couldn't, he said it was a language problem, basically. There's no way to word it. That part of the sugya ended off with Rav Ashi coming up with a formulation that the Torah could have said, but didn't. And the Gemara just leaves it as a kasha. That the kasha being the kasha is a kasha on Reish Lakish, because Reish Lakish said that the Torah couldn't have worded it. And Rav Ashi says, no, it could have. So it's a kasha on Reish Lakish. How could he say the Torah couldn't have worded an azhara when it could have worded an azhara? And the Gemara just leaves it as a kasha, right? When a sugya ends with the word kasha, that's what it means. It means that we're just leaving it as a question. But then the Gemara went on and said, Tana maiti la mehacha. The Tana brings the source for the azhara from here. And then we spent the last, 2 or 3 weeks looking over this part of the Gemara to understand this Tana. And we more or less came to a conclusion based on this last part from Ravina. Ravina says ultimately that this Tana that we quoted learns it as a Gzeira Shava from the words etzem etzem. And I had actually some more things to say about this. I'll just say them very briefly, because otherwise I'll have to go and review the whole sugya, and anyone is, you're all welcome to go back and look at the videos from the previous shiurim. But what happened was in the Braita tried to set up a Gzeira Shava based on the idea that one of the psukim of Isur Melacha was superfluous or redundant, as Paul said last week. And ultimately the Gemara pushes that away. The Gemara said that it's not going to work because you're going to say it's redundant based on a kal v'chomer of melacha and inui, but ultimately we can't prove that there's a kal v'chomer from melacha to inui or from inui to melacha, and so if there's no kal v'chomer, then there's no gzeira shava. And Ravina says actually the Tana is really basing the gzeira shava not on that line of reasoning, but just on the words etzem etzem. In other words, we have a pasuk by Inui that says be'etzem hayom hazeh, and we have a pasuk by Malacha that says be'etzem hayom hazeh. I don't need a proof to say that the pasuk of Onesh Malacha is redundant, because ultimately I know it just from itself because Chamisha Krai Ktivi b'Melacha. There are five because there are five psukim that are written by Melacha, and one of them ends up being extra, right? Because I said there, right? So four of them are for Azharad Yoma, Azharad Laila, and Onesh Diyamama and Onesh Develia, and that leaves one, which would be the pasuk of Be'etzim Hayamazev by Onesh Melacha. That will be superfluous, and so once I know that's superfluous, I can say there's simply a Gzeira Shava from that pasuk, which is now Mufne, to the pasuk of Etzim Hayamazev by Inui, and then it's a relatively simple matter of saying I learned from the pasuk of Onesh Melacha that the Torah isn't ma'anisha without having first brought in Azara like it did by Melacha, and so I can extrapolate from that by this Gzeira Shava that that's also true by Inui, that there's an assumed Azara by Inui. So that's where we got up to until now. As we continue, we'll now see other approaches to this question. So now the Gemara brings a different Braita. The Braita is the Bei Rabbi Yishmael Tana, where we learn from the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Yishmael the following drasha. Ne'amar kan inui, ne'amar lahalan inui. Ma lahalan lo anash elin kain he's here. Afkan lo anash elin kain he's here. So this Braita brings it from, excuse me, 1 second, I thought I was going to bring this up and I didn't. Just give me a second. The Braita here is going to learn a completely different Gzeira Shava. It's going to learn it based on the pasuk of the pasuk of Inui that's here by Yom Kippurim, and it's going to make a Gzeira Shava with the pasuk of Inui by Na'ara Me'urasa. One sec. I'll share my screen. So let's just do a quick review of this.
Can I ask a general question?
Sure.
Yeah. It's very, for me, it's very strange to see how the rabbis try to build constructs on the text which is given. Now, the text is given the way it is given. It has there are things missing or not missing. I don't know. The original text is as it is, but here everyone of these rabbis does a construction on this text to how can I say this, to extract something which isn't there in the original text, and this is very strange.
Well, so you ask a good question. Let me try to give you.
I'm not sure that expressed it the way it should have been. I don't know.
Let me reword it for you, and you'll tell me if this is what you're after. That the on the one hand you have the text of the Torah, and that's given. That's fixed.
Given. Yes, of course.
And it's a fixed text.
Okay.
And it is what it is. Mm-hmm. So let's just take it as it is. So
these are intellectual constructs.
Yeah. So the question. So the question is, what motivates Chazal to make these kinds of constructs, or I'll put it a little bit differently. What motivates Chazal to try lidrosh at text, so to merit that they're trying to dig deeper than what seems to be the obvious pshat of the text? What's motivating them in this direction? So to at least partially answer your question, our sugya actually, I think, is a good example of what may be motivating them. That is, what's the problem here? The problem here is that the Torah, on the one hand, tells us that if you're not mitaneh on Yom Kippurim, that you're chayav karet. So that seems to be very straightforward. Why isn't it straightforward to Chazal? Because Chazal had an understanding, they had a masoret, that the Torah is not ma'anisha b'li azhara. The Torah won't punish you without warning you. That is, that it had, and I think I mentioned this in a previous shiur. Just like, and Chazal learned this out for mortal batei din, right? For regular batei din, in order to be chayav an onesh by beit din, you first have to have an azhara. You have to have two witnesses come and tell you just before you're about to do an Isur, like they see you with a knife in your hand and you're just about to slit somebody's throat. And they stand and they say to you, if you kill this person, you will be chayav mitat beit din. If you go ahead and slit the person's throat anyway, then you can be brought to beit din, and if you're found guilty, then you'll be chayav mita. But if you kill somebody, God forbid, without anybody telling you, without two witnesses telling you that what you're about to do is asur, you can't be given mitat beit din. Beit din can't give you that onesh. They could punish you in other ways, but they can't give you the mitat beit din that is sanctioned by the Torah. So there is this basic concept, which the way I understand it, it's in a sense, it does this idea of azhara and onesh accomplishes a couple of things. One is, in order to ascertain that your intention is to do what you're about to do, you have to have witnesses, and the witness's job is going to be to make sure that you know that what you're about to do is asur. And if nobody is there to warn you, then we don't have proof that you knew that what you're doing is asur. Murder is an extreme example, but let's say it's cooking on Shabbat or something like that. You have to have witnesses telling you when you're just about to cook something that if you cook now on Shabbat, that's asur, and you'll be chayav skila if you cook on Shabbat. And if nobody tells you, it doesn't mean that it wasn't the mezid, but at that point, it essentially goes over to the Kadosh Baruch Hu to decide your fate. There is the din is your chayav karet if Kadosh Baruch Hu knows that you did it b'mezid. So but this basic idea that you have to have an azhara before you have an onesh is a deeply held understanding by Chazal. And so by the same token, it stands to reason that the Torah also gives you an azhara before it gives you an onesh. The Torah wouldn't give you an onesh without first having given you the azhara. The azhara, as we said, that's where the Torah says that such and such is asur. So this is Reish Lakish's problem. He wants to understand, how could it be that I have a pasuk that tells me explicitly that that if you're not mitaneh on Yom Kippurim, that v'nichreta, that you're chayav karet, how could that be without the Torah first having told me, or at least someplace having told me, that it's asur? that there's an isur. So on top of, so first of all, and that's the problem. I have what I think 6 psukim that tell me v'initem, right? That you have the kol nefesh shelo tuneh, some variation of inui. So I know that I have to be mitaneh on Yom Kippurim, but where is the Isur love? Where is the azhara? And this idea of the azhara, like I said, is it has to be there in order for according to Chazal, in order for the Torah to mete out punishment or to define a punishment, it has to give you an azhara. So, based on that concept, that motivates Chazal to figure out where the azhara is. In other words, what's the common denominator that goes throughout the sugya? And we haven't finished the sugya, but you'll see in a moment we have 3 other opinions about this. All of them assume that there has to be an azhara. Nobody says that this is somehow an exceptional case where the Torah punishes you without an azhara. So given that everybody assumes that there has to be an azhara, that motivates them to find the azhara. So based on that motivation, they will use these midot hadrash to build constructs that will allow us to understand that the Torah, in fact, did give us an azhara. It just didn't give it in a more straightforward way. So, and what if we didn't do all that? Then, according to Chazal, in other words, if we don't find the azhara, what's at stake? Then we can't understand how the Torah would give us a punishment. And if there's no punishment, then what happened to Inui Nefesh on Yom Kippurim?
So all these constructs are in the framework of certain rules. You are not
right.
allowed to construct something which doesn't שלא מתאים לחוקים מסוימים, שלא לא נמצא במסגרת של החוקים.
Right. Yeah, so תמיד יש איזשהו מושג שכאילו מובן מאליו, מושג מקובל, right? There's always going to be some underlying concept. And
but the rules are not in the Torah. The rules are the rules of Chazal.
But the rules of Chazal are part of the Masorot of the Torah Shebaal Peh. In other words, all of the constructs, like, and, this is, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, Dafka, because the example we're going to bring now is from Tana Debei Yishmael, and you should know from the Sidur that Tana Debei Yishmael had Shosh Esrei Midot of Drash. Right? That everybody should know this from the Sidur, even if you don't understand them, but they exist. I'll try to address that again in a moment. But so there is, from Chazal's point of view, there is no separation between the Torah Shebichtav and the Torah Shebaal Peh. You can't say just take the Torah, to take the Torah without the Torah Shebichtav, without the Torah Shebaal Peh. That's what the Tzadukim did. That's what the people who rejected Torah Shebaal Peh did. Now, I've talked about this, at various times, and we can go into greater depth, but I'll just say briefly that this idea, the idea that you can't separate Torah Shebaal Peh from Torah Bichtav is illustrated by a famous story in Masechet Shabbat about the non-Jew who comes to Shammai to convert. He says, and I want to convert on the condition that I accept the Torah Shebichtav and not the Torah Shebaal Peh. And Shammai throws him out. And he goes to Hillel, and Hillel says, fine. And he converts him. He says, but you have to come and learn with me. So he starts to learn with him, and he teaches him Aleph Bet Gimel Dalet. And so then the new convert comes back the next day, and Hillel tells him to go and review what you just learned. So he starts to say Aleph Bet Gimel Dalet, and Hillel stops and says, whoa, whoa, whoa. He says, how do you know that's an Aleph? How do you know that's a bet? Maybe this is an Aleph, and maybe this is a bet. And he reverses them. So he says, but that's what you taught me yesterday. So he says to him, the same way that I taught you that is the Torah Shebaal Peh. And this is a very important basic point to understand about Torah Shebaal Peh, that the Torah Shebichtav can't stand by itself as a document, because it's just words on a page. Once you start reading the words, you're already imbuing it with Torah Shebaal Peh. I'm pretty sure I talked about this idea before, right? So you can't have Torah Shebichtav without Torah Shebaal Peh. And like I brought examples, we have languages, we have documents from languages that no one understands anymore because no one speaks those languages. We don't even know how to say the words. There's a whole interesting Wikipedia article about this. People are and until we had the Rosetta Stone, right? We also didn't know how to translate from certain ancient languages. So in Chazal's mind, there's no difference between even the most basic aspects of Torah Shebaal Peh, which would include what we know as nikud v'ta'amim, right? And also how to say those. Just how to say the words is part and parcel of Torah Shebaal Peh. You can't have Torah Shebichtav. Torah Shebichtav will have no meaning without Torah Shebaal Peh. So then you'll say, okay, that much I get. But what about all of these fancy drashot, right? This is like another level. But the point of the Gemara there is to say that that all was received from Moshe at Sinai. There is no difference between these things. Now, you could accept it, you could not accept it, but that's the way Chazal understand. And so now to come back to your original question, so here we have a problem because I have certain klalim that I know from Torah Shebaal Peh, and I know that the Torah doesn't give an onesh without an azhara, but I've looked through the entire Torah and I don't see the azhara for Inui on Yom Kippurim, and so that becomes the motivating factor to figure out where it is. Where do I get it from? So we spent the last, 2 or 3 shiurim going through the one Braita and trying to understand it. And now we're going to go and see other approaches. But the basic problem still, has to be resolved. The basic problem, and like you say, the basic problem is not a problem that presents itself in the Torah Shebichtav, but it is a problem based on what we know from Torah Shebaal Peh.
If there is a machloket, does this mean that between two or more rabbis that they have a different Torah Shebaal Peh, or they just, well, I don't know, or they read it differently, or
I should give a whole separate set of shiurim on this, which I've done in the past, but not in this shiur. We've touched on some of these things. It's a very good question. The Rambam addresses this question in a couple of notable places, beginning in his Hakdama to the Perush Mishnah, but also you can look at the Rambam in the beginning of Hilchot Mamrim, where he lays out in a very methodical fashion, as is the Rambam's way, the way this works, the way this whole idea works of Torah Shebichtav, Torah Sheba'al Peh, and how do we, if everything was given to Moshe at Sinai, how do we get machloket? Where does that come from? Right? Because Moshe was only given one Torah at Sinai. So the quick answer, this is just a partial answer. There are a couple of ways we get to machloket. And one of them is that certain questions arise really in every time and in every generation that are not explicitly discussed in the Torah. And they're not explicitly discussed even by earlier decisions by the Beit Din. And so when that happens, Chachamim have to tzrichim ladun b'zeh, right? They have to discuss it and they have to figure out what the halacha is. And how will they figure out what the halacha is? They're going to figure it out based to begin with on these midot hadrash that we mentioned, because that's the part of the Torah that the Torah Sheba'al Peh gave us as tools for determining halacha from the Torah when the Torah isn't explicit.
It's a kind of machinery which you have to, Manuela, so you have to enact these machineries to get the
machine.
real,
The machine metaphor is I would use the different metaphor. I would just say that these are kelim, right? They're devices, they're tools, and so yes, they're tools that the machine metaphor maybe comes in place because of what you see. Because once I start to use one of the tools, it seems to start off it's like an algorithm, right? It starts a series.
You have a crank and you have to turn the crank, but everybody turns it in a different way.
Well, they may use different cranks. In other words, so for example, famously in the Gemara, we're let's say more familiar with the Bright of Rabbi Yishmael, where he talks about klal uprat, right? Klal uprat, and Rabbi Akiva darshaned using a different midah of drash called ribui v'miut. And ribui v'miut is similar to klal uprat, but it's not the same. It's a different method. It's a different methodology, and so that becomes the basis for machloket in many places between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, because they had different masorot about these midot hadrash. So, but you could also have a machloket even amongst people who agree on all of the midot, and one might say that this midah should take precedence, and another one says this midah should take precedence. And so at the time of, let's say, the Tanaim, they would have these discussions, they'd have diyunim, and if, let's say there were two opinions, sometimes there's more than two opinions, but let's say there are two opinions, and if one side could convince the other side that their opinion is superior, then the other side will concede, and then everybody will agree what the halacha is. And if one side can't convince the other side, so you have machloket. So then how do you decide halacha? So then you have to go to another tier. The next tier down is to say that we're going to go after the majority opinion. So majority opinion has nothing to do with the particular argument that you're having. It's just a separate rule that if you can't, but it means that according to Chazal, both of those opinions are legitimate opinions. They're legitimate ways of understanding the Torah. But for practical purposes, in order to determine halacha, you have to choose. So you have to choose using something that's outside of the argument itself, something that's in a sense an objective standard. So the objective standard is going to be, we're going to go after the majority rule. So that's one way that machloket comes up. And another way that machloket comes up is something that I think you alluded to a moment ago, which is sometimes there are different traditions about what the halacha was. And the machloket comes about because people didn't learn well enough to preserve a pristine version of the original halacha. And so then you get variations as it comes down. And once again, though, you could, so that's a basis for machloket. People had different traditions in terms of the psak halacha. And so there also, then you're going to have to go after, let's say, majority rule in order to determine. But the way I view it, that's a very brief summary of part of the Rambam. But the way what I view about that personally is that it reflects the human condition, which is we're not perfect people. We don't know, no one of us is going to, be able to absorb the entirety of the Torah. In a sense, we all need each other to preserve the Torah. And even in earlier generations, the only person who received the entirety of the Torah that could be received by a mortal was Moshe Rabbeinu. And that's the beginning of Masechet Avot. Moshe kibel Torah misinai, umisara, and then he gave it over. So he gave over what he knew, but the idea of Kabbalah is the person who receives it receives whatever they can receive. The Mesirah could be that he gave over everything. But if you remember in the beginning in Avot, what happens? He says, Moshe kibel Torah misinai. So it means he received as much as he could receive. The Gemara in Masechet Rosh Hashanah says that means that hu kibel memtet sharei bina. He got 49 of the gates of understanding, implying right that the 50th shar was something that he couldn't get. There's a 50th shar that he couldn't get. It's something that no human could get. But he gives it over in its entirety. Masarad Yoshua, Yehushua's kenim Nevi'im, Nevi'im la'anshei knesset hagdola. Right? Vehem kiblu. Then after that, it's kiblu. After that, you have the zugot, vehem kiblu mehem. So once again, there's an idea that as much as Moshe was able to get from God, he was able to give over in its entirety. But by the time we get to Anshe Knesset Hagdolah and Kufat Bayit Sheni, we come to the reality that from there on, people are mikabel, meaning they can only receive as much as they can receive.
But it changed on the way, because afterwards, when Moshe is sitting in the Beit Midrash, he doesn't understand anything anymore. So that means that there were things did evolve.
Well, actually, that particular example is not a good example, because what is Moshe sits in the shiur of Rabbi Akiva, and right tashash kocho, because he doesn't understand, and until one of the students asks Rabbi Akiva, Rebbe minayin, right? How do you know? What does Rabbi Akiva say?
Moshe.
He says halacha Moshe misinai. And so what's the point? Rashi says there, that story begins when Moshe first goes up to heaven to receive the Torah. So he hadn't yet received it when he sits in the shiur of Rabbi Akiva.
He hasn't yet received it.
When that story happens, he has not yet received the Torah. Right? How does the story start? The story starts with Kisha'ala Moshe Lamarom.
Yeah.
It's and then he says, right, why Mimi Akel al Yadecha, to the Kadosh Baruch Hu, who's making you put ktarim on the letters?
Mhm.
And he tells them it's going to be Rabbi Akiva, and he asks to see Rabbi Akiva. He sits in the shoe of Rabbi Akiva, and he doesn't understand it. But then he understands it's Halacha Moshe Sinai. So when he realizes when he goes back, he's going to learn from the Kadosh Baruch Hu. In other words, he has not yet received that. So that's not a good example of change, because there I'll say no. That could be that's exactly what Rabbi Akiva said, that Moshe has yet to learn from the Kadosh Baruch Hu. However, we digress. So
Okay.
this, it's a worthwhile digression. Paul, I know this is something that it interests you, and you ask questions about this. It's something that deeply interests me, and like I say, if you want to take the time yourself, look at the first couple of chapters of Hilchot Mamrim in the Rambam, and also Beli Neder. If I remember, I'll send you the particular passage from the Hakdama to the Perush al Mishnah. This is the Rambam's approach, and I think it's a very good and reasonable approach. So back to our sugya. So knowing all this, so now we have this question that that all of these chachamim are interested in. So it's interesting the way the sugya is constructed, because the sugya is constructed by first bringing Reish Lakish, who's a first generation Amorah, and he asks as a question. He asks as a question, why didn't the Torah express the Azhara of Inui? In other words, Reish Lakish's question implies that the Torah I didn't talk about this until now, but I wanted to get to this, so we'll say Reish Lakish his question implies that actually I could have done without the Azhara, in the sense that what Reish Lakish says is, why didn't the Torah expressly give me an Azhara? So what does that imply? The Torah, it goes back to maybe what you were saying earlier. In other words, Pshuto shel Mikra is there is no Azhara for Inui. And all Reish Lakish is wondering is, why didn't the Torah give me an Azhara? When the Gemara says V'tana maiti la mehacha, that Tana assumes that the Torah did give me an Azhara, but it gave it to me in ways that are much more subtle, that I have to darshan them out. And then from there on, the rest of the sugya is based on that idea that it's incumbent upon me as an active limud to darshan out the azhara, for the reasons that I said, that wouldn't be right. We couldn't expect that the Torah would give us an onesh without an azhara. It could be that Reish Lakish held that that's not true. That once the Torah gave me the onesh, there'll be an implied azhara just by itself. There's the Yerushalmi here also brings a version of Reish Lakish, which maybe we'll get to later. Later meaning when we finish this part of the sugya. So okay, so we had the Tana Maiti La Mehacha. The Tana tries to learn it. The Tana learns it out ultimately, according to Ravina, by way of a drasha of etzem, by way of a gzera shava. There are other problems with that part of the sugya that we're not going to deal with, which I've thought about, but I'm going to leave that for now. now we're at the Tana Debei Rabbi Yishmael. So now I want to point out something. The first drasha that we've been working on now for a while, where it says Tana Maiti La Mehacha. I showed it to you. It's in the Sifra, right? On Parshat Emor. It's in the Sifra on Parshat Emor. The Sifra is, in fact, a product of Bei Rabbi Yishmael. The Braita, and this is what I said I'll get to in a second, right? So the Braita of the Shlosh Esrei Midot of Tana de Bei Rabbi Yishmael, that is the introduction to the Sifra. If you open up the Sifra, that Braita that's in the Sidur, that's the first thing that you'll see in the Sifra. And it introduces you to the idea that there are these Midot of Drash, and that will be the basis for understanding what I'm going to present, what the Midrash is going to present to you now. So first of all, it's a little interesting to me that the Braita that we brought presumably was from Rabbi Yishmael, and now we're bringing also a different Braita from Tana de Bei Rabbi Yishmael. So what does that mean? Maybe there were different traditions even within the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Yishmael. That's like a side bracketed, historic kind of question. Hold on. Let's understand though what Tana de Bei Rabbi Yishmael is saying. So he says, now let's go back and just remember what he said. So he says, Ne'emar kan inui v'ne'emar lahalan inui. Ma lahalan lo anash elim ken he's here. Afkan lo anash elim ken he's here. So the inui here, of course, is the inui of Yom Kippurim. Where else do I see lashon of inui? Ne'emar lahalan. It's said elsewhere inui. So Rashi tells us where else Ne'emar lahalan inui. Al davar asher ina adeshet reyehu. So that's the pasuk that we're going to look at now. So beginning here, let's just do a few psukim. Beginning here, Dvarim Chaf Bet. Ultimately, we need to get to pasuk Chaf Dalid, which is the end of this part of the parsha. But let's just remind ourselves what the context is. So the Torah says, Ki kach ishisha. What if a man marries a woman and comes upon her, and he has intercourse with her, and then he hates her? V'samla alilot dvarim v'hotzia la shem ra. Right. So he's this is the parsha of Motzi Shem Ra. Right. He's going to say something bad about her. V'amarati shazad lakachti. Michael Werner, are you still with us? Not exactly. Okay. So what does he say? He claims that when he had bia with her, that she was not a virgin. So they bring her betulim out. In other words, they bring out the sheet, presumably that was underneath her when she had her first intercourse with her husband, and they show it, and they accuse the husband of defaming her, and then so he gets punished, right? V'yisruoto, he's chayav malkot, and he has to pay. All right. And what if it was true that his accusation, maybe there is no proof that she was a Tula, then she's chayav mita. Then we go into another case. So if we find a man who lies with a woman who is married, then both of them are chayav mita. Ha'isha shocheva ma'isha, v'ha'isha uviarta haram Yisrael. Right. So both of them are chayav mita. Then we have another case. Ki yenara betula ma'urasa. What if we have a virgin who has been betrothed, right? So she's now not fully married, but she's engaged, and that's an official status. Murasa ish ish ba'ir v'shachavima. If a man found her in the city and lied with her, had intercourse with her, then v'otzeitem et shnehem el shar ha'ir hahi. You bring both of them out to the gate of that city. Uskaltem utam ba'avanim v'meitu. You stone them with stones, and they will die. Etanara al davar shelo tza'aka be'ir. Why does she die? Because she didn't cry out in the city. In other words, meaning presumably she didn't object, so she was complicit. V'eta'ish al davar she'ina et eshet re'ehu. Why does the man die? Because he was ina, the wife of his compatriot. Uviarta harami kirbecha. So here's where we see inui. So we didn't actually have to go through all these other psukim, but it was just sort of get you into the parsha. So
it's a completely different inui.
Oh, so this is an interesting thing. We actually, the Gemara though learned elsewhere from this inui. What is this inui? What does it mean? Al davar she'ina teshet re'ehu. What does ina mean here?
Violate.
Why do you say that? Just because it fits, or you have some other proof?
Because it seems to fit.
Okay.
But
I mean,
also, I seem to, yeah, no, it seems to fit, but I'm maybe.
no, I'm. It's not a bad translation. The question is, so when I see ina here, so let's say it means to violate. What else we had a sugya earlier in the Gemara about dinui? So what does it mean here? What does it mean elsewhere? Here, we associate inui with a different pasuk, that a man is chayav to his wife onata, and inui, in that sense, could mean simply having intercourse. We also saw it by Shem, right? So it could just mean having because he had intercourse with her. But what doesn't it mean? It doesn't seem to mean what it means by Yom Kippurim, right? What is inui?
It has nothing to do with food here. The connotation is sexual.
The connotation is sexual, but nonetheless, we could. Now I'm just curious to see what the way they translated it. Hold on a second. Here they have your translation, Michael. He has violated his neighbor's wife. So, but as we know, inui, this word inui is a kind of a difficult word. It has different meanings in different contexts. So the Bei Rabbi Yishmael's drasha, though, what we could say, b'pshuto shel inyan, is that the Bei Rabbi Yishmael holds that ultimately it's the same word. And since it's the same word, I can extrapolate from it. So then this would be, if that's true, then this is a kind of classic Gzeira Shava, which is that I see this word here, al davar she'inat eshet rehu. And in this context, the Torah is explaining to me why this man is chayav skila. That is, why is this man chayav an onesh? Why does the Torah give him a punishment? It's because asher ina et eshet re'ehu. So just like here, the Torah gave an azhara and an onesh. So where's the azhara for this man? It's not here. It's not in this pasuk.
I seem to recall that it's back in the Acharei Mot.
Well, you all know the Aseret Dibrot, right?
Yeah, it's to commit adultery in one of the Ten Commandments.
The Azara is in the Aseret Dibrot, Lo Tinaf. The Torah there gives you an azhara, but it didn't tell you what the onesh is. Here, the Torah tells you what the onesh is. So it's a classic case of the Torah giving you an azhara and then giving you the onesh. So this man gets the onesh because of inui eshet reyehu. So Tana Rabbi Yishmael says, just like this inui doesn't get punished except on the basis of an azhara that the Torah gave. So it must also be true that the inui of Yom Kippurim, by implication, also has an azhara. It has an azhara based on this Gzeira Shava. That I'm going to compare it directly to Inui by Na'aram Urasa. So presumably, we might be able to say more than this, but based on just a simple reading of the Gemara, according to Tana Rabbi Yishmael, it's enough that the word is the same, even if in this context the Inui is a different Inui. And I'm going to leave it at that, but in order to go deeper, I would say go back to the earlier sugya where the Gemara talked about Inui, and it's going to come up again later in a later Gemara. So I'm going to leave this as is. So this Braita of Tana Debei Rabbi Yishmael answers the question that the previous Tana also wanted to answer, which is, where is the azhara? How do I know that? From where do I see an azhara for inui nefesh on Yom Kippurim? So he says, I learned by Gzeira Shava from inui of the Na'aram Urasa. Okay, let's do another one. Rav Acha bar Yaakov Amar, Yalif Shabbat Shabbaton, Mishabbat Bereshit. Ma lahalan lo anash elim kain he's here. Afkan lo anash elim kain he's here. So what's the Shabbat Shabbaton? So in our psukim in Parshat Acharei Mot says Shabbat Shabbaton hilachem v'initem et nafshotechem chukat olam. So Rav Acha bar Yaakov says, I can learn it out from these words, Shabbat Shabbaton. How does he learn it out? One second. Getting lost here. There we go. No. Do you see the Gemara on your screen now? Or do you see Psukim?
I see the Gemara.
Okay. There's something wrong on my side. So he says, I learned it out from Shabbat Shabbaton, mi Shabbat Bereshit. So what's Shabbat Bereshit? What does he mean, Shabbat Bereshit?
The Shabbat, that's the seventh day of creation.
Okay, and so what do I know about Shabbat Bereshit that's relevant here? He's saying, I learn out Shabbat Shabbaton from Shabbat Bereshit, just like over there by Shabbat Bereshit, the Torah doesn't give a punishment without giving Azhara. Here also the Torah doesn't give a punishment without giving Azhara. So what does he mean I learn out from Shabbat Bereshit? What's the Onesh in Azhara?
Just as there is a Azara for Shabbat Bereshit, there must be one for Yom Kippur.
Basically, yes. In other words, the Torah. So Shabbat Bereshit is just another way of saying Shabbos. I learned it out from Shabbos. The Torah gave us a din of Shabbat every week, which I can refer to as Shabbat Bereshit. Why do I call it Shabbat Bereshit? Because I have to contrast it with where the Torah uses the term Shabbat when it doesn't mean Shabbat Bereshit, like Yom Tov or Yom Kippurim. So Yom Kippurim is also called Shabbat. The Torah calls it Shabbat Shabbaton. So once I know that it's called Shabbat Shabbaton, then I can say, oh, just like Shabbat, that happens every week, the Torah gave me an Azhara and it gave me an Onesh, so too the Torah must be giving me, again, by Gzeira Shava, I can learn out by Gzeira Shava that this is true also for Shabbat Shabbaton of Yom Kippurim. So that's the way Rav Acha Bar Yaakov answers the question. Rav Papa Amar, Hu Gufe Shabbat Ikre. In other words, I don't need a Gzeira Shava to say the Torah says Shabbat here by Yom Kippurim, it says Shabbat by Shabbat Bereshit. I can just say that the Torah itself tells me that Yom Kippurim is also called Shabbat. It's not the same as Gzeira Shava. In other words, he's saying, I don't need now an outside pasuk to compare it to. I can just look at the pasuk. It says, Tishpetu Shabbatchem. Where's that? What happened to my psukim? In Parshat Emor, the Torah says, Shabbat Shabbaton hu lachem, v'nitem et nafshotechem, v'tish'a lachodesh, ba'erev, me'erev ad erev, tishpetu Shabbatchem. So now I want to learn out from the word Shabbatchem, that Yom Kippurim itself is called Shabbat. So let's see Rashi. He gufa Shabbat ikre. The Yom Kippurim itself is called Shabbat. Ubelav gzeira shava nami nafka minei ubei. Even without a gzeira shava. In other words, I don't need the word Shabbat here and the word Shabbat there. I could just say that the Torah calls Yom Kippurim a Shabbat. I can learn it out from it itself. The Kevandi Ikre Shabbat, the Inyan Inui, Havale Shabbat, La'onesh Va'azhara. And I'll understand that when the Torah calls Yom Kippurim Shabbat, in this context of Inui, right? That's the pasuk that we just read. That means it must be just like Shabbat for Onesh and Azhara. That is, the Torah didn't have to juxtapose Inui with the word Shabbat, but it's telling me that Inui on Yom Kippurim is just that because Yom Kippurim itself is Shabbat, that's part of why you can't be that you must be mitaneh on Yom Kippurim. So I learned it out from that pasuk itself, without having to learn it out from Shabbat Breshit. I learned it out from Tishbetu Shabbatchem. So Rashi here gives two explanations of how the limud works. He says Tishbetu Shabbatchem. He says Ume Shabbat Shabbaton lo gamar diikre Shabbat. From the pasuk of Shabbat Shabbaton, which was what Rav Acha Bar Yaakov said, that he learned it out from Shabbat Shabbaton. He says, I don't learn out from that that Yom Kippur is called Shabbat. Why not? Ditzrichle l'rebuye kol ha'inuyim kedamran bereish pirkin Shabbat Shabbaton. So, if you remember, and you may not remember, this goes back a few months ago, at the beginning of this sugya, the Gemara is interested to know in the list of inuyim, right? The Mishnah listed all of the inuyim. Right? Yom Kippurim asur b'achila v'shtiyah b'rechitza v'sicha v'nilat asandal v'tashmi shamita. And so then I wanted to know, why does the Mishnah use this term asur? You're chayav karet. And so then there's this whole discussion between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish that Rabbi Yochanan says that you're chayav chatzi shiur min Torah, but you're not going to be chayav for an onesh for chatzi shiur. So the Mishnah uses the term asur. It's asur to do these things on Shabbat, on Yom Kippur, but you won't be chayav an onesh. And then Reish Lakish said no, chatzi shiur is only asur midrabanan, but that's why it uses this lashon of isur. And as we skip through, we understand the Gemara. Gemara asks, "V'kol heicha de anush karet lo dani asur." I feel like I'm not going to go through this part of the sugya again. I want to get to the part that Rashi's alluding to. The Gemara ultimately concludes, Kiktani asur ashara. When the Mishnah says that Yom Kippurim is asur b'achila shtiyah and all of the rest of the inuyim, it really just means the lashon of isur really only is pertinent to the other inuyim. The Tanud Rabba v'Rav Yosef b'shar Sifrei Debei Rav Minayin liyom kippurim she'asur b'rechitza b'sicha v'nilat sandal b'tashmi shamita Talmud Lamar Shabbaton, which we know is this pasuk of Shabbat Shabbaton. This maybe wasn't a good reminder. I didn't maybe remind you well enough. But the point of the Gemara here is to say that Rabba and Rav Yosef learn out from this pasuk Shabbat Shabbaton. They needed to tell me that the Torah is oseret the other inuyim besides achila v'shtiyah. In other words, so now we know. If you say that, if I say that Shabbat Shabbaton tells me that that the Torah is oseret these other Inuyim. So I've already used that pasuk. It's not open to be used for another drasha. Each pasuk can only this idea in drasha, that was this idea of mufne. If I don't need a pasuk, then it's open for drasha. But here I've used this pasuk. I used the pasuk of Shabbat Shabbaton. And once I've used the pasuk of Shabbat Shabbaton to tell me Sha'ar Inuyim, the other Inuyim, I can no longer use it to tell me something else, like there's a Gzeira Shava between Yom Kippurim and Shabbat Breshit. So let's go back. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov says he learns it from Shabbat Shabbaton, Shabbat Breshit. He learns that there's an Azhara for Yom Kippurim from Shabbat Breshit. Then what would be the Gzeira Shava, right? Just like over there by Shabbat Breshit, Lo Anash Elim Ken is here. Afkan Shabbat Shabbaton, that Shabbat here, Lo Anash Elim Ken is here. Rav Papa says, Hu Gufe Shabbat Ikre, that Yom Kippurim is itself called Shabbat. And once it's called Shabbat, then I can say that it's going to be that there's going to be an implied or an inbuilt azhara. He Shabbat he gufa Shabbat ikre v'lav gzeira shava nami nafka mine obey. Even without a gzeira shava, I'll learn it out from the pasuk itself of Tishbetu Shabbatchem. Kevan de ikre Shabbat li'inui, since the Torah calls Yom Kippur Shabbat as far as Inui goes, Havelek Shabbat la'onesh v'azhara. Then it's also going to be like Shabbat to be chayav in a punishment along with the azhara. And Rav Papa learns it out from Tishbetu Shabbatchem. And Rashi now says, Umi Shabbat Shabbaton lo gomar tikre Shabbat. He doesn't, in other words, Rav Papa, you might say, why didn't he just say that when the Torah says Shabbat Shabbaton, that's also the Torah calling Yom Kippurim Shabbat. So Rashi says he doesn't learn it out from that pasuk because he like the earlier Amorim, Rabban and Rav Yosef, he needs that pasuk to tell me Shar Inuyim. He needs to tell me all the other Inuyim, like we said in the beginning of the parak. That's the sugya that we looked at. Inami, or else, why does he learn Tishbetu Shabbatchem? Inami Shabbat Shabbaton he love Yoma Ikre Shabbat. The day itself, from the words Shabbat Shabbaton, it's not telling me that the day itself is called Shabbat. Now, this is a more grammatical argument. Elahachi kamar, menucha margoa hilachem. When the Torah says Shabbat Shabbaton hilachem, Shabbat Shabbaton hu lachem, right? That's what there's a diuk lashon here. This pasuk of Shabbat Shabbaton, there's two Shabbat Shabbatons. One says Shabbat Shabbaton hi lachem, binitem et nafshotechem. And there's also a pasuk that says Shabbat. It's the next pasuk, not the next pasuk. The first one is in Achremot, and the second one is Emor. Shabbat Shabbaton hu lachem. So what is the he, and what is the who? So Rashi says that Rav Papa won't learn Shabbat Shabbaton to mean Shabbat, to learn it as a Gzeira Shava to Shabbat Breshit, because when the Torah says Shabbat Shabbaton hilachem, it doesn't mean that the day is called Shabbat. It means that this time is a time of rest. In other words, it's not the same Shabbat as Shabbat Breshit. It just means it's a time of rest. And that's why it says Inami Shabbat Shabbaton Lav Yoma Ikre Shabbat. The day itself of Yom Kippurim is not called Shabbat. It's descriptive. It's a day of rest. Elahachi Kamar Menuchat Margoa Hilachem. It's relaxing, it's calming relaxation for you. Vehechanami dichtiv Shabbat Shabbaton hu lashon zachar, af lashon menucha hu lashon zachar, aval Yoma lo ikre Shabbat. The day itself is not called Shabbat. I'll explain this in a minute. The day itself is not called Shabbat from this pasuk of Shabbat, Shabbaton hilachem. Lahachi nakat tishpetu Shabbatchem yitera. That's why Rav Papa uses the pasuk of tishpetu Shabbatchem. Here it's clearly not descriptive. And it's telling me that the day itself is Shabbat. It's extra. Dehu gufe ikre Shabbat. It's telling me that it itself is called Shabbat. So listen, it's late, and I told you last week and try to keep this to an hour. So it's an hour and 10 minutes since we actually started learning. I'm going to stop here. Next time we're going to look over these drashot again with Rashi, and then we'll go to the next part of the sugya. I don't know if we'll finish it, but hopefully we will. The Gemara is going to ask after this why Rav Acha Bar Yaakov and Rav Papa, essentially why they didn't agree. Why didn't one use the other's pasuk? And it's going to give arguments to each one of them. And ultimately we'll finish off the sugya. For the purposes of the big question, so today we saw 3 answers to the question of where we see an azara for Inui on Yom Kippur. We saw Tana Debei Rabbi Ishmael, who says, I learned it from Inui of Naramu Rasa. I saw Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, who says, I learned it from Gzeira Shava of Shabbat Shabbaton. And I saw Rav Papa that says that Yom Kippur itself is Shabbat. It is called Shabbat. And now I want to know why Rav Papa and Rav Acha Bar Yaakov didn't say each like the other one. Why did they say specifically like the way they said? So we'll stop here. I'll let everybody get some rest. And hopefully we'll see you next week.
Thank you. Good night.
Cool.
Good night. Bye-bye.